Hello, everyone. This is Lecture 3 for California Labor. It's titled Defining American. What you have in front of you are three different pictures that are emblematic of different historic moments in historic spaces here in terms of U.S. history, all of which are attached to the idea of both immigration, labor, and citizenship, or more importantly, who's allowed in and who's not. Starting with the far left is a line of immigrants who are waiting in line at Ellis Island. Most of us know Ellis Island from our history books. It's the emblem or the symbol that we attached with Ellis Island is, of course, the Statue of Liberty. And Ellis Island was considered to be the portal for immigrants to the United States from the East. And many celebrate the history of Ellis Island, of the melting pot that the United States was supposed to be, and that it was the symbol of freedom, escape from oppression or repression, and that it was a new beginning, and it was an entryway into the land of opportunity. In stark contrast, in the middle, you have a picture taken at the Angel Island Immigration Station, which many of you may already know is on an island just out in the San Francisco Bay. The history of Angel Island is much more checkered, if you will, and certainly a much sadder and more dire racist picture of U.S. immigration, particularly when entry came from the West. For those of us who don't understand the history of Angel Island, it is where many Chinese, but actually people of all races, most especially from Asiatic countries, as well as there's some notations in more recent work done by Judy Young that also shows that Mexicans were also held there as well. But the Angel Island facility was a space where particularly Chinese immigrants were held before they came into the United States. And the Angel Island Detention Center, immigrants would have to wait there from anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. They were subject to tests to test whether or not they belonged here in the United States. And if any of you were to take a trip out to Angel Island and hike up to the historic site, you'll see that there were poems carved into the walls of the barracks, chronicling what a dire situation it was, particularly for Chinese immigrants. I will go into much greater detail a little bit later, but this idea of open doors and a welcome to America was vastly different. Angel Island and Ellis Island would be considered polar opposites. The third picture, the one to the far right, is actually a picture of the Okies from Oklahoma. Next week, you'll be reading a set of newspaper articles that John Steinbeck wrote in association with his book, The Grapes of Wrath. But these newspaper articles really chronicled the experiences of the Okies who were escaping the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma and coming to California to look for greater opportunities. And the reason that I also put the Okies into this sort of migration story is that they were migrating to California for new opportunities, to be able to overcome the Great Depression and to find work, particularly in the fields of California. The Okies played a very important role in California history, but also point to the ways in which race becomes a significant factor in terms of upward mobility and the ability to escape. But it also tells the story of how class and status lead to a rationalization for the mistreatment of workers. In other words, different communities at different times would have access to different rights and protections, both in terms of the law and in terms of the social values and mores of the time. In this lecture, I want us to think a little bit about defining American. We'll talk a little bit about citizenship, citizenship as it relates to work, and then I'll outline some things I want you to think about as you're reading the Gary Okihiro piece, East to West, from his book, Common Ground. I'd like you to take a minute and to think about and answer the following question. How do you define American? Now, since I don't have you in person, all I can do is assume that a number of your answers will align with the answers that previous classes I've taught have answered. There are, this is not an exhaustive list, but I imagine that many of you may have answered the question, how do you define American, in the following ways. You might have said, I would define American as individuals who were born or naturalized in the United States. Naturalized, for those of you guys who know, or who don't know, it means that you took a U.S. citizenship test and that you passed it and ultimately took an oath to become a U.S. citizen. Some have said that these are individuals who are guaranteed rights by the U.S. Constitution. Now, this could include people who are citizens, but the ways in which my previous classes have framed it is anybody who has access to those rights. They didn't define citizenship as a criteria. Others have said individuals who belong to a country in North or South America. This is a much more kind of global view. The United States of America is not the only one with America in the name. If you look at the name of Mexico, there's also Americas in the official name of Mexico as well. I won't burden you with my very bad Spanish accent by reading it. But go look on a map or go Google it. But they take a much more global perspective of the Americas include any country in North America, Central America, or South America. Everything from Brazil, Chile, Nicaragua, Peru, Mexico, the United States, Canada are all part of the Americas. And so being American means you're a citizen of any of those countries. Others have said it's individuals who live in the United States. Again, this is about where you're living, not necessarily characterized by being a citizen or not. And others have said that that it's anybody who can live in the United States free of persecution, that they attach it to this idea of freedom. Now, some of you may have had a few of these different answers there. Some may have had only one answer there. But part of what I'm trying to get at is that this notion of American is a very sort of fluid and open category. It is a category that is constructed in different ways at different moments by different people. Sometimes how people define American is based on their politics. For others, they define it on lived experiences. Others attach it to a very particular set of rights. And this class is going to ask you to keep revisiting this idea of American and how you yourself would define American. And as you'll find in the Okihiro reading, he too also proposes, or at least talks about, a very specific construction of what it means to be American. And that is something you should be able to answer, is how would Gary Okihiro construct what it means to be American, or how did his article construct what it means to be American? So I bring this forward as a theme for this class because how we define American is very much attached to how we think about who has access to protection, particularly for workers and for labor. Now, going back to this idea of citizenship, which is something that Evelyn Nakano-Glenn talks about in week one's readings. Citizenship does, in fact, have a very sort of legalistic definition. And so for those who are attached to a much more legal construction of what it means to be a citizen, citizenship is defined as a state of being vested with the rights, privileges, and duties because of one's membership in a nation state. In other words, that you belong to a particular country and that you are bound and your loyalty is to that country. What has become the symbol of citizenship for so many of us is the passports, is the passport that we hold. If you're like me, when you travel out of the country, you have a little blue book that says the United States of America on the front, passport. And this passport basically endows me with very specific privileges based on the U.S. foreign relations with a different country. So, for example, I know that I can fly to Europe and enter any of the European Union countries, like Italy, for example, and they will scan my passport, and I know I have 45 days that I could travel throughout the European Union. In other places, for example, when I've traveled to Peru, I had to have a visa before entering the country. So in addition to my passport, I also had to have official permission from the state. And all of those privileges, how quickly you can enter a country, how long you can stay, if you're allowed to enter a country, are all based on the pre-negotiated laws and foreign agreements, foreign national agreements between countries. But what that passport ultimately means is that you belong and that you are endowed with particular rights, privileges, and duties. And when we talk about duties, this is particularly a very gendered idea. But for example, if you are a male over the age of between the ages of 18 and 25, you know that you must be registered for the draft, and that your duty as a U.S. citizen is that in a time of war and the U.S. government can put the draft into effect, and you can be drafted into the U.S. military. That is one of the duties that you are obliged to do. Rights also includes the ability to vote for who will be president or your representative in the House of Representatives. That citizenship is determined by the U.S. Constitution, federal and state statutes, and court rulings. In other words, what we know of who's allowed to be a citizen was not something that was easily prescribed in our Constitution. We know that over time it's evolved. As I noted in our previous lecture on linked labor histories, we know that that 20% of the United States population in 1790 were slaves, were enslaved. They were not considered citizens and certainly didn't have full citizenship until the 14th Amendment was put into effect, right? Or until the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect, and then there was also the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment. So, what we begin to understand, right, is that who's allowed to be a citizen in the United States changes over time. What the requirements to become a citizen are often change. But we do know that this is a process that is both prescribed by law. It is also a matter of different statutes that are put in place, as well as sometimes people have had to fight to be considered a citizen of this country. There are numerous types of rights, and these types of rights are something that you should take note of. There are civil rights, rights of the individual in law. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equal protection. A lot of these are the types of laws that you are entitled to as a U.S. citizen under the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Bill of Rights. There are political rights, the right to participate in elections and to run for political office, the right to vote, women's suffrage, right? These are political rights that are also guaranteed in the law. So note that these political rights can also overlap with civil rights as well. But for the purposes of the discussion, we understand the idea to participate in elections, and those rights that are associated with are political rights. And finally, social rights, the right of every individual to enjoy a certain minimum standard of economic welfare and security. Now, these things could be minimum wage, sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, Social Security. It's important to note that particularly as we begin talking about organized labor and different campaigns and different ways in which workers assert their rights, that at different moments of time, they focus on different types of rights. We know, for example, since today is as I'm recording this, is the 50th anniversary of the Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and that what he was fighting for were civil rights. Civil rights for for unions, particularly for African American unions. The Pullman's Union in the 1950s with A. Philip Randolph was a very important central fight for historically black unions in the South. That civil rights were attached to workers' right and the dignity of labor. And so we do have a long history, particularly outside of California, of unions rallying for rights. Now, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, this isn't uniformly true. And at different moments, unions have been on the right or wrong side of these discussions. The more contemporary battle that some unions are involved with are around immigration rights and immigration reform. Some unions have chosen to be part of trying to exert or advocate for both civic, political, and social rights for immigrants, while others have tried to block it. But part of what I want you to think about is what types of rights are unions fighting for? and why do they think it's important. As you'll find, that a lot of what unions fight for are in that third category: social rights, minimum wage, living wage, sickness benefits, health care. These are all considered social rights, of which we know, based on people's political persuasions, people believe that they should or should not have access to. But pay attention to the types of rights that unions are struggling for, because I think it is important to understand how they're also attached to the demographics of a union, the time period that the unions are organizing in, but also it sometimes points to tensions within unions. So pay attention to these types of rights. It's extremely important as you move forward. Are citizenship rights distributed equally across different groups of people? This is a question that you should be asking yourself as you go through the different readings. As I've already noted in sort of previous lectures, that these different citizenship rights are going to be things that we talk about, and I'll come back to this question. Another question that you should be asking yourself is, do all workers have access to the same rights? So those two questions are going to be very central to how I want you to read our text. Do all groups of people have access to the same rights, and do all workers have the same access? Do all workers have access to the same rights? Going back to this term unequal citizenship, and if you can't tell, since I'm repeating it twice now, in out of 3 lectures I brought this definition up twice, this idea of unequal citizenship is really a hinge point for our discussions in this class. And kind of going back to these different rights, political, civic, and social rights, we want to start asking ourselves, in what ways might access to rights, resources, and privileges be different? Again, as Nakano Glenn has defined in her reading, in the reading that you did for Nakano Glenn, unequal citizenship refers to the ways in which rights, resources, and privileges are distributed unevenly across different social groups, categories, and geographies. Now, it's not enough to just say, yes, it's unequal. Group A had access to this while Group B did not have access to these things, whether it's water, it's break times, it's pay. But part of what we want to understand is what is the underlying structure, or what power issues were in play that led to these inequalities, to this type of stratification. Just as importantly, when we think about citizenship, it's used to draw boundaries between those included as members of a community and entitled to respect, protection, and rights, and those excluded and thus not entitled to recognition and rights. Some of this becomes very poignant, and I really want you to keep this definition in mind as you begin to read first the John Steinbeck readings next week. As we begin to think about the experiences of the Okies in California and how they were treated. Take note of the ways in which people are included or excluded as members of a community. And also define what are those communities. So this idea of unequal citizenship is more than just the unequal access to rights, but it's also about drawing the lines about who belongs and who doesn't. And so these are some reading tips for throughout the semester. And if you take notes of these, or if you ask these questions as you're going through the readings, it will help you particularly on your reading journals. Because if you're able to journal, particularly on a week where there's an open prompt, journaling about any of these ideas can really be very fruitful in terms of drawing themes across the board. So while completing your readings for the semester, ask yourself the following questions. Do some groups have access to more rights and protections than others? If yes, what rights? And why do you think this occurs? Now, I know that why do you think this occurs sounds like an opinion question, but here it's important for you to cite evidence. What proof do you have? If you say there's a power differential, well, what's the evidence of that power differential? So again, think about evidence when I ask questions like that. How does the unequal access to rights and protections impact workers? How does it shape their experiences? So bringing this down to the micro level, how does it impact workers' lives? Are there debates about rights that are going on in these texts? If so, what types of rights? What were the central arguments for the debate? Why? And so again, here we want to be specific about the types of rights. Are we talking about debates around social rights? Are you talking about debates around political or civil rights? It's important to think about these things because some of these rights are embedded or encoded and protected by law, while others are considered legislative, things that we would need to fight to have legislation for. And I think that these become some of the battlegrounds for unions in the contemporary context. Now, going back to this idea of defining American, or the definition of American, Gary Okihiro spins a tale, if you will, around that is very attached to The Wizard of Oz, particularly the book The Wizard of Oz, because as you'll note, for those of you guys who read through it, he talks about the silver slippers. We all know that if you were to have only watched the movie The Wizard of Oz, you would have only seen the ruby slippers, right? It's written differently. So know that he is referring to the text, not the movie. But part of the takeaway points that Gary Okihiro gets to is that the definition of American isn't simple. That it isn't simply a tale of everyone being a part of a melting pot and becoming one. In fact, it's not even a story that's necessarily based in being inclusive of all Western Europeans. It was constructed around a very specific ideal of being a Midwesterner, and that it was attached to very specific meanings of what it meant to be an immigrant. It was attached to a particular portrayal of race and gender, and and as I've already noted, to very specific geography, the Midwest. So being American, according to Okihiro in his writing, does not formulaically fit into a discussion of citizenship. It's not just about rights and privileges, but it's so much more than that. It becomes attached to symbols, a particular viewpoint, a particular perspective, a particular set of morals and values. And so part of what you should be able to do, and what I encourage you to write about in your first reading response, is talk about how Okihiro says being American is constructed. Be able to understand why that construction is so important. Because what Okihiro gets at, particularly towards the end, is that construction of what it means to be American also defines who has access to rights and privileges, who has the ability to exert power in the United States. So some things I would consider in my reading response. According to Okihiro, how is America defined? How is it attached to the Midwest and Kansas? Why is the agricultural setting so important? What values are attached to Americanness? And how do these things influence our understandings of work and labor in the United States? Now, I know this was a little bit of a shorter lecture, which I'm sure you guys are all heartbroken over. But in the next lecture, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the ideas of race and gender, and laying down some very specific concepts around race and gender. And this will be the end. The next lecture will be the end of Module 1, which really it was about setting all the groundwork, if you will, all the foundational concepts for the rest of the semester. So hope you are moving your way through the readings, and please feel free to contact me if you have any additional questions. Have a good day.